Officer Blake Turner was having the kind of week that makes you question your career choices. It was only Wednesday, and he'd already received 3 formal complaints from citizens who said he was too aggressive during routine stops. His sergeant had called him into the office twice this week alone, warning him about his attitude and telling him to dial it back before someone filed a lawsuit against the department. Blake wasn't in the mood to hear any of it. He'd been a cop for 8 years, and in his mind, people just didn't respect authority anymore. Everyone had a phone, everyone thought they were a lawyer, and everyone wanted to tell him how to do his job. The complaints were probably from troublemakers anyway. People who couldn't follow simple instructions and then cried when they faced consequences. That morning had started badly too. His coffee maker broke. He got stuck in traffic for 20 minutes, and when he finally made it to the station, his patrol partner called in sick. So there he was, working alone again, patrolling the downtown area near the federal courthouse with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove. The courthouse district was usually quiet in the mornings. Lawyers in expensive suits walked quickly between buildings, their phones pressed to their ears, talking about cases and deadlines. Blake often wondered what it would be like to have a job where you wore a suit instead of a uniform, where people respected you automatically instead of seeing you as the enemy. It was around 10:30 when he spotted her. A woman in a dark business suit was crossing the street, but not at the crosswalk. She was jaywalking, plain and simple, about 50 feet away from where she should have been crossing. Blake's eyes lit up. Finally, an easy citation. Something straightforward that nobody could complain about later. He pulled his patrol car over and got out, adjusting his belt and putting on his most authoritative voice. The woman seemed distracted, looking at her phone while she walked quickly toward the courthouse steps. She looked professional enough, probably another lawyer, but rules were rules. If he let every person in a suit break traffic laws, what kind of message would that send? "Ma'am, stop right there," Blake called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. The woman looked up from her phone, seeming genuinely surprised to see him approaching. She had an air of confidence about her, the kind that comes from someone used to being in charge, but Blake had dealt with plenty of entitled professionals before. "Excuse me?" she said, glancing at her watch. She seemed more concerned about the time than about the fact that a police officer was addressing her. "You just jaywalked across that street," Blake said, pointing back to where she'd crossed. "There's a crosswalk right there, and you chose to ignore it. I need to see your ID." The woman looked genuinely confused for a moment, as if she was trying to process what was happening. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm actually running very late for an important court hearing. Could we possibly handle this quickly, or maybe—" "Ma'am, I don't care if you're late for tea with the mayor," Blake interrupted, his patience already wearing thin. "You broke the law, and now you need to provide identification. It's not complicated." What Blake didn't realize was that this woman wasn't just any lawyer running late for any court hearing. She was Victoria Hayes, the newly appointed chief federal attorney for the entire district. She'd been in the position for only 3 months, but she'd already made a name for herself as someone who didn't back down from tough cases. She was currently prosecuting a major federal corruption case involving city officials, and that's exactly the hearing she was rushing to attend. Victoria tried to remain calm. She'd dealt with difficult situations before, and she knew that escalating this encounter wouldn't help anyone. "Officer, I completely understand that jaywalking is against the law. You're absolutely right about that. I was distracted and made a mistake. I work in this building right here," she said, gesturing toward the federal courthouse behind them. "And I really do need to get inside for a court proceeding that started 10 minutes ago." But Blake wasn't interested in explanations. In his experience, everyone had an excuse, and everyone claimed to be more important than they actually were. He'd heard it all before. "Look, lady, I don't care if you work in that building, you own that building, or you're married to someone who works in that building. Right now you're someone who broke traffic laws and is giving me attitude about it." Victoria's phone started buzzing insistently. She could see her assistant's name on the screen, probably wondering where she was. The federal judge was notoriously strict about punctuality, and every minute she stood here was another minute that a major federal case was being delayed. "Officer, may I please just answer this call?" It's regarding the court case I mentioned, and if I don't— No, you may not answer your phone, Blake cut her off sharply. When a police officer is talking to you, you give them your full attention. Put the phone away and give me your ID now. This was exactly the kind of situation Victoria had been working to address in her role as chief federal attorney. She'd been pushing for better training programs for local law enforcement, trying to improve community relations and reduce unnecessary confrontations. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her, but she also knew that how she handled this moment could make everything worse. "Officer, I'm going to reach into my purse to get my identification," she said slowly and clearly, making sure her movements were visible and non-threatening. "I'm not reaching for anything else, just my wallet." Blake watched her carefully as she pulled out a leather wallet and extracted her driver's license. But when she handed it to him along with another card, he barely glanced at the second one. If he had looked more carefully, he would have seen her federal prosecutor identification card, which clearly stated her position as chief federal attorney. Instead, he focused on the driver's license, checking the name and address while Victoria stood there, very aware that she was now 20 minutes late for one of the most important hearings of her career. Her phone continued to buzz, and she could see people she recognized from the courthouse walking past, some of them doing double takes, when they saw her standing with a police officer. "So you live over in Riverside Heights," Blake said, looking at the address. "Pretty fancy neighborhood. Let me guess, Daddy's a lawyer and you think that makes you special?" Victoria felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "Officer, I'd prefer not to discuss my personal life. Could we please finish this quickly? I understand I made a mistake jaywalking, and I'm prepared to accept whatever citation you need to give me, but this court hearing really cannot wait any longer." But Blake was just getting started. The morning's frustrations, the complaints against him, his sergeant's warnings, it all seemed to bubble up at once. Here was another entitled professional who thought she was above the law, and he was tired of it. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice getting louder. "You people think you can do whatever you want just because you wear expensive suits and work in fancy buildings. Well, let me tell you something. I don't care how important you think you are. Today, you're just another person who broke the law and is going to face the consequences." Victoria realized this situation was spiraling out of control in a way that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. What happened next would go down as one of the most embarrassing moments in Officer Blake Turner's career, though he had no idea at the time. Victoria Hayes stood there, watching as Blake's frustration reached a boiling point. She could see the anger building in his eyes, and she knew from her years of experience in law enforcement that this situation was about to get much worse. Blake had made up his mind. This woman was everything wrong with society, entitled, demanding, and completely disrespectful of authority. When Victoria's phone rang again for the third time and she instinctively glanced at it, that was the final straw for him. "That's it," Blake said, his voice rising. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Victoria couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Officer, surely you're not serious. This is about jaywalking." "This is about your complete failure to cooperate with a lawful police investigation," Blake shot back, reaching for his handcuffs. "You've been argumentative. You keep trying to use your phone when I told you not to, and you clearly think you're above the law. I'm arresting you for obstruction of justice and failure to comply with lawful orders." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. As a federal prosecutor, she'd seen cases where situations like this spiraled completely out of control. She knew that resisting, even verbally, would only make things worse. She also knew that Blake was making a career-ending mistake, but there was no way to make him understand that without escalating the situation further. "Officer Turner," she said, reading his name badge and keeping her voice as calm as possible. "I want to be very clear that I am not resisting. I am complying with your instructions. But I need you to understand that arresting me will create complications that I don't think you've considered." But Blake wasn't listening anymore. He was in that zone that some officers get into when their ego takes over their judgment. He spun Victoria around and snapped the handcuffs on her wrists, not roughly but firmly enough to make his point. "The only complication here is that you thought you could talk your way out of consequences," Blake said as he secured the cuffs. "Well, Guess what? Today's the day you learn that doesn't work with everyone. What Blake didn't know was that inside the federal courthouse, Victoria's assistant, Jennifer, was frantically searching for her boss. Victoria was now 30 minutes late for a hearing that involved 3 federal defendants and had been scheduled for months. Judge Harrison was known throughout the district for his strict adherence to schedules, and he was not happy. Jennifer had already called Victoria's cell phone 6 times. She'd checked the parking garage, the coffee shop across the street, and even the ladies' room on every floor of the courthouse. She was starting to panic. Victoria had never, not once in the 3 months Jennifer had worked for her, been late for a court appearance without calling ahead. Meanwhile, outside, Blake was leading Victoria up the courthouse steps in handcuffs. The irony was almost too much to believe. He was literally walking one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the state up the steps of her own workplace, treating her like a common criminal. Other people were starting to notice. A group of defense attorneys who had just finished their own hearing walked past, and one of them did a double-take when he recognized Victoria. His mouth fell open, and he stopped walking entirely. "Is that?" he whispered to his colleague. "Oh my God, it is," the other attorney whispered back. "That's Victoria Hayes, the chief federal attorney. What in the world is happening?" They weren't the only ones. A federal marshal who had worked with Victoria on several cases was coming down the courthouse steps when he saw the scene unfolding. He recognized her immediately and couldn't process what he was seeing. "Ma'am," the marshal said, approaching carefully. "Is everything all right here?" Blake turned to face him, his chest puffed out with authority. "Everything's fine, officer. I've got a suspect here who was jaywalking and then refused to cooperate with my investigation. She's been argumentative and disrespectful, so I'm bringing her in." The marshal looked at Victoria, who gave him the slightest shake of her head, a signal that he shouldn't interfere right now. The marshal had worked in law enforcement long enough to recognize when a situation was too delicate to handle on the courthouse steps. "Understood," the marshal said carefully, though his expression made it clear he thought Blake was making a massive mistake. "Carry on." As they continued up the steps, more courthouse staff began to notice. A court reporter who had worked on several of Victoria's cases saw her and nearly dropped her equipment bag. 2 FBI agents who were heading to their own hearing stopped in their tracks. Victoria maintained her composure throughout all of this. She knew that losing her temper now would only make headlines tomorrow, and not the kind that would help her career or her ongoing cases. She also knew that this was exactly the kind of situation that proved her point about the need for better police training and accountability. Blake, meanwhile, was completely oblivious to the stares and whispered conversations happening around him. In his mind, he was doing exactly what a good police officer should do, enforcing the law equally, regardless of how someone was dressed or where they claimed to work. "You see," he said to Victoria as they walked through the courthouse doors, "this is what happens when people think they can just ignore police officers. Maybe next time you'll think twice before jaywalking, and then giving attitude to the cop who catches you." Victoria didn't respond. She was thinking about the federal case that was now 45 minutes behind schedule, about the defendants whose constitutional right to a speedy trial was being affected, and about how this entire situation was going to play out in the media once word got out. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was buzzing with tension. Word was spreading quickly through the hallways that something unprecedented was happening. Court clerks were whispering to each other, and several attorneys had pulled out their phones to start making calls. Jennifer finally spotted them as they came through the main entrance. When she saw her boss in handcuffs being escorted by a police officer, she felt like she was having a nightmare. "Ms. Hayes?" Jennifer called out, her voice cracking with confusion and concern. Blake looked at the young woman approaching them. "You know this person?" She's my boss," Jennifer said slowly, still trying to process what she was seeing. Blake rolled his eyes. "Right. Let me guess. She's the CEO of some big company and you're her assistant, and this is all just a big misunderstanding." Jennifer looked at Victoria, who again gave her a subtle signal to let this play out. "Something like that," Jennifer said quietly. The small crowd that had been following them was growing larger. Word was spreading through the courthouse like wildfire, and people were starting to gather just to see what was happening. Everyone seemed to know that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Blake felt energized by the attention. In his mind, he was finally showing everyone how a real police officer handles disrespectful citizens. He had no idea that he was actually about to become the cautionary tale that would be used in police training seminars for the next decade. Inside courtroom 4B on the third floor, Judge Patricia Harrison was losing her patience fast. She had been a federal judge for over 20 years, and in all that time she had never had a chief federal attorney simply not show up for a major case. The courtroom was packed with people waiting for this hearing to begin: defense attorneys, federal agents, court reporters, and even some media representatives who had been following this high-profile corruption case. Judge Harrison looked at her watch for what felt like the 100th time. It was now 11:15, and the hearing had been scheduled to start at 10 sharp. She had already delayed things as long as she could reasonably justify. "Counselor," she said, addressing one of Victoria's assistant prosecutors who was sitting at the government's table looking increasingly nervous, "do you have any idea where Ms. Hayes might be? This is highly unusual." The assistant prosecutor, David Chen, was sweating under his collar. He had tried calling Victoria's cell phone repeatedly, but it kept going straight to voicemail. This wasn't like her at all. Victoria was the most punctual person he knew, sometimes arriving at the courthouse 2 hours early just to review her notes one more time. "Your Honor, I honestly don't know," David said, standing up respectfully. "Ms. Hayes was supposed to be here by 9:30 to review some last-minute evidence. I've been trying to reach her, but I can't get through. This is completely out of character for her." The defense attorneys were starting to whisper among themselves, wondering if they should request a postponement, or if this was somehow part of the prosecution's strategy. The lead defense attorney, Robert Sterling, stood up. "Your Honor, given the unusual circumstances, perhaps we should consider rescheduling this hearing, if the prosecution isn't prepared to proceed." But Judge Harrison held up her hand. She had dealt with enough games over the years to know when something was genuinely wrong versus when someone was playing tactical delays. Her instincts told her that something had actually happened to Victoria Hayes. "We'll give it 5 more minutes," Judge Harrison announced. "If Ms. Hayes doesn't appear by then, we'll have to discuss how to proceed." At exactly that moment, the heavy courtroom doors swung open with more force than usual. Every head in the room turned to see what was happening, and what they saw left everyone speechless. Officer Blake Turner walked confidently into the courtroom, his hand firmly gripping the arm of a woman in handcuffs. But this wasn't just any woman. This was Victoria Hayes, the chief federal attorney who everyone had been waiting for. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Court reporters stopped typing mid-sentence. Defense attorneys' jaws literally dropped open. Federal agents who had worked with Victoria on dozens of cases sat frozen in their seats, unable to process what they were seeing. Judge Harrison, who had maintained her composure through everything from screaming defendants to courtroom brawls, found herself staring in complete shock. In all her years on the bench, she had never seen anything quite like this. Blake, still completely unaware of the magnitude of his mistake, approached the bench with Victoria in tow. He was actually feeling pretty good about himself. He had handled a difficult situation professionally in his mind, and now he was going to show this courtroom full of fancy lawyers that nobody was above the law. "Your Honor," Blake announced loudly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "I have a suspect here who was jaywalking near the courthouse and then became uncooperative during my investigation. She was argumentative and refused to follow simple instructions, so I arrested her for obstruction of justice and failure to comply with lawful orders." The silence stretched on for several more seconds. Some people in the gallery were actually holding their breath. Others were trying not to laugh, not because the situation was funny, but because the sheer absurdity of it was overwhelming. Judge Harrison finally found her voice, though it came out slightly higher than usual. "Officer, I'm sorry, what's your name?" "Turner, Your Honor. Officer Blake Turner with Metro Police." "Officer Turner," Judge Harrison said carefully. "Before we proceed, I need to ask the defendant to state her name for the record." Blake nodded approvingly. Finally, someone who understood proper procedure. "Go ahead," he said to Victoria. "Tell the judge your name." This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, though Blake still didn't realize it. Victoria looked directly at Judge Harrison, her voice clear and steady despite everything she had been through. Victoria Elizabeth Hayes, Chief Federal Attorney for the Eastern District. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Blake felt like someone had just punched him in the stomach. The color drained from his face so quickly that people in the front row could actually see it happening. "I'm sorry," Blake said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Could you repeat that?" But Victoria didn't need to repeat it. The entire courtroom had heard her clearly the first time. Judge Harrison was looking at Blake with an expression that was part amazement, part concern, and part something that might have been pity. In the gallery, defense attorney Robert Sterling was frantically scribbling notes. This was the kind of situation that created legal precedents and newspaper headlines. He was already thinking about how this incident might affect his client's case. David Chen, Victoria's assistant prosecutor, was staring at his boss with a mixture of relief that she was safe and horror at what had just happened. He knew that this incident was going to have consequences that went far beyond today's hearing. The federal agents in the courtroom were exchanging glances that said everything. Without words, they had all worked with Victoria on cases involving police misconduct, and the irony of this situation wasn't lost on any of them. Blake's hands were shaking as he looked around the courtroom, finally understanding that everyone was staring at him for reasons that had nothing to do with admiration for his police work. The reality of what he had done was hitting him like a freight train. Judge Harrison cleared her throat, trying to restore some semblance of order to her courtroom. "Officer Turner, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here." "Your Honor," Blake said, his voice cracking slightly. "I had no idea. She didn't tell me. I was just doing my job." Victoria finally spoke up, her voice still calm and professional despite everything. "Your Honor, I apologize for my tardiness. I was unavoidably detained, as the court can see. However, I'm prepared to proceed with today's hearing if the court wishes to continue." The professionalism in her voice only made Blake's situation worse. Here was a woman who had just been humiliated and wrongfully arrested, and she was more concerned about the court's schedule than about getting revenge on the officer who had embarrassed her. Judge Harrison looked at Blake, then at Victoria, then back at Blake again. She was trying to figure out how to handle this situation in a way that wouldn't make things even worse for everyone involved. "Officer Turner," she said finally, "I think you need to remove those handcuffs immediately." Blake's hands were shaking so badly he could barely work the key. As he unlocked the handcuffs, he kept mumbling apologies under his breath, but everyone in the courtroom could hear him. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. Nobody told me." The moment the handcuffs came off, Victoria rubbed her wrists briefly, then straightened her jacket and walked to the prosecution table as if nothing unusual had happened. But everyone in that courtroom knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. The silence in the courtroom was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was staring at Officer Blake Turner, watching as the full weight of his catastrophic mistake settled on his shoulders like a crushing burden. His face had gone from confident and authoritative to pale and terrified in the span of about 10 seconds. Blake's mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The woman he had arrested for jaywalking, the woman he had lectured about respecting authority, the woman he had handcuffed and dragged into this very courtroom. She was the chief federal attorney. Not just any prosecutor, but the top federal law enforcement official in the entire district. Judge Harrison was watching this unfold with the kind of fascination you might have watching a train wreck in slow motion. In her 20 years on the TU bench, she had seen defendants collapse. Attorneys have nervous breakdowns and witnesses faint under pressure. But she had never seen a police officer realize in real time that he had just made a career-ending mistake. Victoria Hayes stood at the prosecution table, calmly organizing her papers as if being wrongfully arrested was just another minor inconvenience in her day. But everyone in that courtroom could sense the steel beneath her professional composure. This wasn't a woman who would forget what had happened, and it certainly wasn't a woman who would let it slide without consequences. The defense attorneys were having a field day with this. Robert Sterling, who had been practicing law for 30 years, was frantically taking notes. He knew that what had just happened could potentially affect not just this case, but every case this officer had ever worked on. Police misconduct didn't just embarrass the officer involved. It could throw entire investigations into question. Your Honor, Robert said, standing up slowly. Given what we've just witnessed, I think the defense needs to request that this hearing be postponed while we evaluate how this incident might affect the proceedings. Judge Harrison nodded. She was thinking the same thing. Ms. Hayes, do you wish to respond to that request? Victoria looked up from her papers, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly calm and professional. But there was something in her eyes that made Blake take a step backward. Your Honor, while I appreciate the defense's concern, I don't believe that Officer Turner's misunderstanding should delay justice for the defendants or the people of this district. However, I do think this incident highlights some important issues that this court and the community need to address. Blake felt like he was drowning. Every word Victoria spoke made his situation worse. She wasn't screaming at him. She wasn't demanding his badge. She wasn't even raising her voice. Somehow, that made it infinitely more terrifying. David Chen, Victoria's assistant prosecutor, was still staring at his boss in amazement. He had worked with her for 2 years, and he had never seen her lose her cool, not even when facing the most hostile defense attorneys or difficult witnesses. But this was different. This was personal, even though she was handling it with complete professionalism. In the gallery, the federal agents who knew Victoria were exchanging looks. They had all heard her give speeches about police accountability and the need for better training in law enforcement. They had seen her prosecute cases where officers had overstepped their bounds, and now they were watching her become the perfect example of exactly what she had been fighting against. Blake finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Ms. Hayes, I need you to know that I had no idea who you were. I was just doing my job. You were jaywalking, and then you seemed uncooperative. Victoria turned to look at him directly for the first time since the handcuffs had come off. Her expression wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. It was the look of someone who was disappointed but not surprised. Officer Turner, she said quietly, I want you to think very carefully about what you just said. You arrested me because you thought I was uncooperative, but what you actually mean is that you arrested me because I didn't show you the level of deference you thought you deserved. Is that correct? Blake opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come, because when she put it like that, it sounded exactly like what had happened. He had escalated a simple jaywalking incident into an arrest because his ego had been bruised. Blake stammered. But everyone in the courtroom could see that Victoria had hit the nail on the head. Judge Harrison intervened before things could get worse. Officer Turner, I think you should probably return to your duties. Ms. Hayes, shall we proceed with today's hearing? But Victoria wasn't finished. Actually, Your Honor, if I may address the court for just a moment longer. What happened today is exactly why my office has been pushing for enhanced training programs for local law enforcement. Officer Turner made assumptions about me based on how I looked and how I spoke. He escalated a minor traffic violation into an arrest because he felt disrespected. And he did all of this while standing in front of the very courthouse where I work every day. The courtroom was hanging on every word. This wasn't just about Blake anymore. This was about systemic problems in law enforcement that Victoria had been fighting throughout her career. Your Honor, Victoria continued, I don't say this to embarrass Officer Turner or to seek personal revenge. I say it because this incident is a perfect example of what happens when officers aren't properly trained to de-escalate situations, when they prioritize their authority over actual public safety, and when they make assumptions about people based on appearance rather than facts. Blake felt like he was getting smaller with every word. He wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that he was just trying to do his job, but everything Victoria was saying was absolutely true. He had made assumptions. He had escalated unnecessarily. He had prioritized his ego over common sense. The media representatives in the courtroom were scribbling furiously. This was the kind of story that would be front-page news by tomorrow morning. Police officer arrests chief federal attorney for jaywalking was exactly the kind of headline that would capture public attention and spark debates about police accountability. Robert Sterling stood up again. Your Honor, in light of Ms. Hayes's statements, the defense feels it's even more important that we postpone these proceedings. The prosecution has just admitted that there are systemic problems with law enforcement in this district. How can we proceed with a case that relies heavily on police testimony when the chief federal attorney herself has questions about police conduct? It was a smart legal move, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Blake's mistake wasn't just embarrassing. It was potentially damaging to every case the prosecutor's office was working on. Victoria smiled slightly, and Blake realized that she had seen this coming. She had known exactly what the defense would do with this situation, and she was prepared for it. Your Honor, Victoria said, while I stand by my comments about the need for better police training, I want to be very clear that Officer Turner's actions today, while inappropriate, don't reflect on the professionalism and integrity of the many excellent officers who have worked on this case. The evidence in this matter speaks for itself. Regardless of what happened this morning, Judge Harrison was impressed despite herself. Victoria had just turned a humiliating personal experience into a teaching moment, defended the integrity of her case, and managed to make her point about police reform all at the same time. Blake, meanwhile, was beginning to understand that his problems were just beginning. Word of this incident would spread throughout the police department within hours. His sergeant would hear about it. His captain would hear about it. Internal Affairs would definitely hear about it. But worse than all of that, he was starting to realize that Victoria Hayes was right about everything she had said. Judge Harrison looked at Officer Blake Turner with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who had just set their own house on fire. The courtroom was still buzzing with tension from Victoria Hayes's powerful statements about police reform, and everyone could sense that this story was far from over. Officer Turner, Judge Harrison said firmly, I think it would be best if you return to your duties. This court has business to conduct. Blake nodded quickly, eager to escape the nightmare he had created for himself. But as he turned to leave, Victoria's voice stopped him in his tracks. Officer Turner, she said, her tone still professional, but carrying unmistakable authority, I want you to understand something before you go. What happened today wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a failure of judgment that highlights exactly why federal oversight of local law enforcement practices is so necessary. Blake turned back to face her, his face burning with embarrassment. Every person in that packed courtroom was staring at him, and he knew that this moment would follow him for the rest of his career. Ma'am, he started. But Victoria held up her hand. I'm not finished, she said quietly. In my role as chief federal attorney, I've seen cases where officers have violated citizens' civil rights because they let their personal feelings override their professional training. Today, you made me the subject of such a case. The only difference is that I have the power and platform to ensure that this incident becomes a learning opportunity, rather than just another statistic. The weight of her words hit Blake like a physical blow. She wasn't just talking about embarrassment or departmental discipline. She was talking about federal civil rights violations, the kind of charges that could end his career and potentially land him in prison. As Blake finally left the courtroom, walking on shaky legs past the staring faces of attorneys, federal agents, and court staff, the real consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. Within 30 minutes of his departure, news of the incident had spread throughout the courthouse like wildfire. Court clerks were calling their friends in other departments. Defense attorneys were texting their colleagues. Federal agents were making calls to their supervisors. The story was growing and changing with each telling, but the core facts remained the same. A local police officer had arrested the chief federal attorney for jaywalking. By noon, Blake's cell phone was ringing constantly. First, it was his sergeant, demanding to know what had happened. Then it was his captain, whose voice was so loud that Blake had to hold the phone away from his ear. Then it was Internal Affairs, scheduling an immediate interview. But the calls that really worried Blake were the ones he wasn't getting. His patrol partner, who usually checked in during lunch breaks, wasn't answering his texts. His friends in the department seemed to have suddenly become very busy. Even his own brother, who was also a cop in a neighboring jurisdiction, hadn't returned his calls. Meanwhile, back in the courthouse, Victoria was conducting business as usual. The hearing proceeded smoothly, and she presented her case with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the entire incident. But everyone in that courtroom could sense that something had changed. There was a new edge to her voice when she talked about accountability and justice. During the lunch recess, Victoria's assistant David pulled her aside. "How are you holding up?" he asked. That had to be incredibly humiliating. Victoria smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile her staff was used to seeing. "Actually, David, I think Officer Turner did me a favor. I've been trying to get the city council to approve funding for police training programs for months. After today, I don't think I'll have any trouble getting their attention." She was right. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Victoria's phone was ringing with calls from city officials, police administrators, and community leaders who had heard about the incident. Everyone wanted to know what had happened and, more importantly, what Victoria planned to do about it. The media attention started around 3 o'clock. A local news reporter who had contacts in the courthouse had heard whispers about the incident and started making calls. By 5 o'clock, news vans were parked outside both the courthouse and the police station. Blake, who had spent the afternoon in meetings with internal affairs investigators, walked out of the police station to find cameras and microphones shoved in his face. "Officer Turner, is it true that you arrested the chief federal attorney this morning? Did you know who she was when you handcuffed her? How do you respond to allegations that this was an abuse of power?" Blake pushed through the crowd without saying a word, but the damage was already done. The footage of him hurrying to his car, with his head down, would be on the evening news within hours. That night, the story led the local news on every channel. "Police officer arrests federal prosecutor for jaywalking" was exactly the kind of story that captured public imagination. Social media exploded with commentary, memes, and heated debates about police accountability. Victoria watched the news coverage from her home office, where she was working on a speech she had been invited to give at a police training conference the following month. The irony wasn't lost on her that Blake's mistake had given her the perfect real-world example to illustrate every point she had been trying to make about law enforcement reform. The next morning brought even more consequences for Blake. His captain called him into the office to inform him that he was being suspended pending a full investigation. The police union representative who sat in on the meeting shook his head sadly and told Blake that this was going to be very difficult to defend. "Blake," the union rep said, "I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. You arrested the one person in this city who has the power to make your life very, very difficult. And worse than that, you proved every point she's been trying to make about police overreach. But the suspension was just the beginning." Within a week, the FBI had opened a civil rights investigation into Blake's conduct. The Justice Department announced that they would be reviewing all of Blake's previous arrests to see if there was a pattern of misconduct. And the City Council, which had been dragging its feet on police reform for years, suddenly scheduled emergency meetings to discuss new training requirements and accountability measures. Victoria, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity in legal circles. Her handling of the situation was being praised as a masterclass in turning personal adversity into professional opportunity. Law schools were asking her to speak to students about crisis management. Police training academies were requesting copies of her statements about the incident to use in their curricula. 3 months later, Blake was formally charged with violating Victoria's civil rights under federal law. The case made national news, not just because of the original incident, but because it represented a broader conversation about police accountability that was happening across the country. Victoria prosecuted the case herself, not out of personal revenge, but because she believed it was important to show that no one, not even law enforcement officers, was above the law. During her opening statement, she looked directly at Blake and said, "This case isn't about jaywalking. It's about whether we live in a society where citizens can be arrested simply for failing to show proper deference to a police officer's ego." Blake was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 6 months in federal prison followed by 2 years of probation. His law enforcement career was over, and he became a cautionary tale used in police training programs across the country. But perhaps, the most lasting consequence of Blake's mistake was the change it brought to police training and accountability in the district. Victoria used the incident as a catalyst for comprehensive reform, and within a year the city had implemented new training programs, accountability measures, and community oversight procedures that became a model for other jurisdictions. The woman Blake had dismissed as just another entitled professional had turned his moment of poor judgment into a legacy of positive change that would affect law enforcement for years to come.